A city the size of modern Paris does not simply disappear. Yet by the 15th century, one of the largest urban centers on Earth was already coming undone. Not in flames, not in a single decisive sack, but from within. Angkor, the political and ceremonial center of the Khmer Empire, did not end in one catastrophic moment. There was no singular night that erased it. Instead, it unraveled piece by piece, until the mechanisms that held nearly 1 million lives together began to fail. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, Angkor was not just large. It was built at a scale that had no real comparison in mainland Southeast Asia. What we call the city today was actually an immense, low-density urban network stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. Roads moved through forest corridors, residential zones formed around temples. Agricultural fields extended outward in carefully organized patterns that were anything but accidental. And beneath all of that sat the real foundation of the empire: water. Huge barrages collected the monsoon rains. Canals redistributed that water across the landscape in controlled flows. Embankments and spillways managed the transition between seasonal extremes. This hydraulic system stabilized rice production and reinforced political authority at the same time. Monumental temples, such as Angkor Wat, were not only sacred architecture. They were visible proof that the Khmer state could command labor, planning, and environmental control on a massive scale. Angkor did not rise because the climate was forgiving. It rose because it handled variability better than its rivals did. That achievement brought enormous strength. It also tied the entire city to the constant functioning of a very complicated system. For more stories like this, subscribe. The urban network required continuous maintenance. Sediment had to be removed, channels reshaped, dikes reinforced after each monsoon. The more extensive the infrastructure became, the less flexibility it had when something went wrong. For generations, the balance seemed stable. Then, during the 14th and early 15th centuries, conditions shifted. Paleoclimate evidence from tree rings and lake sediments points to prolonged droughts, interrupted by episodes of unusually intense monsoon rainfall. Reservoir levels declined during extended dry periods. When heavy rains returned, they often arrived with enough force to damage infrastructure that had already been strained. Canals filled with sediment faster than they could be cleared. Spillways failed in places, water moved outside its intended paths. So the same network that had once reduced environmental risk began, slowly, to magnify it. This was not a dramatic, single disaster. It was accumulated stress inside a system that depended on precision. Agricultural reliability weakened. Labor that might have expanded the city was redirected toward repair. Political authority had to absorb those pressures while maintaining legitimacy, and this internal strain was unfolding at the same time as external challenges. To the west, the kingdom of Ayutthaya expanded from its base in what is now Thailand. Conflict between Angkor and its western rival intensified during the 15th century. And in 1431, Ayutthaya forces are traditionally described as capturing Angkor. For a long time, that date was treated as the decisive explanation. Invasion meant collapse. The story appeared straightforward. However, archaeology complicates that version. There is no consistent evidence of widespread, citywide burning across the urban core, nor a clear destruction layer that would signal total devastation. What the material record suggests instead is gradual demographic contraction and political relocation. Around the same period, the regional economic landscape was also evolving. Maritime trade networks across the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea were becoming more influential. River-connected and coastal centers tied into Chinese and Indian Ocean commerce gained increasing strategic importance. An inland agrarian megacity that depended on vast hydraulic works was no longer the only viable path to power. Given those shifts, the Khmer elite began moving southward, closer to emerging Mekong trade routes. Angkor did not vanish in a sudden vacuum. It thinned, it reorganized, it shifted its center of gravity. Monumental construction declined sharply during the 15th century. Large-scale water management was no longer maintained with the same intensity as before. As infrastructure deteriorated, agricultural resilience weakened further. The system that had once absorbed instability now transmitted it more directly across the landscape. Even so, Angkor was never entirely abandoned. Communities remained in the broader region, and Angkor Wat transitioned from a Hindu state temple into a Theravada Buddhist center, continuing in religious use for centuries. The disappearance, therefore, was political and demographic rather than absolute destruction, which makes the ending less dramatic but arguably more disturbing. A city that may have ranked among the largest on Earth did not need apocalypse to lose its dominance. It faced converging pressures: climate volatility, military strain, economic realignment, and infrastructure operating near its limits. Each of those pressures might have been manageable in isolation. Combined, they reshaped the system. Angkor had been built for a relatively stable monsoon regime, centralized divine kingship, and inland agrarian dominance. When those underlying conditions shifted, the same scale that once amplified prosperity distributed stress throughout the network. The jungle did not conquer Angkor in a single sweep. It expanded gradually into spaces that hydraulic authority and centralized power no longer maintained. By the time royal power consolidated farther south, the old capital had already crossed a structural threshold. The reservoirs still existed, the temples still stood, but the integrated network that once sustained imperial scale no longer functioned in the way it had before. Collapse, when it happens like this, rarely announces itself in obvious terms. It can feel temporary, manageable, perhaps even reversible. Right up until the largest city in mainland Southeast Asia becomes a ceremonial landscape framed by forest. Not destroyed in spectacle, but slowly dismantled by accumulated strain. Angkor did not fall in one decisive blow. It unraveled over time, and that is how complex systems usually disappear. If you found this valuable, a like helps.